Hello, everyone, to our second webinar, I think, in 2026, the seventh years we're running the webinar series. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. My name is Esther Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Thank you for joining the webinar that is jointly run by the Wolf Institute and by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, with many partners, too many to name. Many of you in the audience are very familiar with the webinars, but for those who are not, just a quick introduction to the two main host institutions. The Wolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, public engagement, policy work. Please have a look at our website and our YouTube channels to learn about our work. The Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997, and it is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th century. This is the moment that we use to introduce the journal of the Society, Al-Masak, which comes as part of the subscription to the Society. So our membership gives you 3 of these beautiful journals coming to your house. So consider joining the very, very reasonably priced membership of the Society. Also a very quick introduction of how the webinar itself works. We have a Zoom webinar audience. Actually, this is the second last time we'll have the webinar audience. Very soon we'll be switching over to another mode of delivering these webinars. So we're also recording this. If you want to rewatch it or if you want to recommend it to anyone to watch, you can have a look at the Wolf Institute YouTube channel. It will be available there very soon. Our topic today is, very excited about it, challenges to government in the medieval Mediterranean. And we're joined by our chair, Professor Gregory Lippiatt from the University of Exeter, who will introduce all the speakers and who will chair the webinar. So, Gregory, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Yes, as Miriam said, it's a real pleasure to be hosting this particular webinar because I think the theme is a really exciting one, and we've got a very, very exciting panel. So to begin with, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Jones, who's a historian of intellectual, emotional, and I think the political life of the Middle Ages and the intersection between those three. Peter is a Marie Curie Fellow at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, where he's joined after teaching at the School of Advanced Studies at the University of Turin, where he was the chair of history. And he's also taught at University College London, New York University, University of Toronto. He's held an enormous number of fellowships at various places. He's published a really outstanding monograph called Laughter and Power in the 12th Century, which came out with OUP in 2019. And it's a study of the role of humor in politics at the court of Henry II. And I very, very highly recommend it. It's a great book. And I'm very excited to announce that he has a second book that is coming out in April called Self-Help from the Middle Ages, which is also very exciting. We're very much looking forward to that. There it is. Peter's holding it up.
Yes.
That's coming out with Penguin. So run, don't walk to pick up your copy now. Or in April, I suppose, when it comes out. But today, Peter's going to be talking to us about Governing Paradise, Reformation and Diversity in the Politics of Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada. So over to you, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gregory. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to talk to you all. I hope you can see my screen. You can see the presentation. Fantastic. Okay. All right. Right. Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada died in 1247, is still a pivotal figure in Iberian medieval historiography. As a crusading hero, he was once a symbol of a Francoist Christian Spanish identity. Conversely, he's been called an emblem of the convivencia, or in the words of Matthias Meiser, a multiculturalist. Most recently, Maya Sophia Irish has drawn attention to Rodrigo's pragmatic laissez-faire policy towards Jewish communities, while Lucy Pick has argued something similar for his approach to Islam. But how serious was Rodrigo, this archbishop of Toledo, figure of enormous importance, not only in the city government, but also in the government of Castile? How serious was Rodrigo about practicing an interfaith government? Was his interest in accommodating Jews and Muslims just a political convenience, or was it part of a sincere project of reconciliation? Today, my paper will try to answer this question very briefly by looking at Rodrigo's intellectual output. And I want to look sideways, not at his politics, but at his theology, and specifically his apocalyptic theology. Taking Rodrigo as an example of what I call apocalyptic city planning, I will argue that he was a more wholehearted theorist of diversity than has been supposed. And to explain this, I'm going to dive into his philosophy of creation and the reformatio of the world machine that he described across his writings. Framing his politics, I want to suggest, was a larger intellectual project, one that sought to keep social and cultural tensions in equilibrium in a broad genetic, racial, linguistic, and social coalition to match what he believed were the original mechanics of the created world. An ambitious project for 10 minutes. Okay, Rodrigo's discussion of the heavenly city begins through critique. In the 5th book of his Dialogus, he systematically dismantles what he characterizes as the contemporary Jewish idea of the earthly urban paradise. He does this through a dialogue he has with a rabbi in Toledo. And he critiques the Jewish idea of the earthly paradise on 3 grounds. First, material. It would be impossible to build a city on earth that would survive the apocalypse. Second, his second critique is biological. Physical bodies, anyway, would be unfit and unworthy of enjoying the earthly paradise. And finally, social or sustainability grounds, my favorite of the 3. It'd be impossible to sustain any such community of perfection without the kind of slave labor and communal exclusivity that contradicted the prophecies of Isaiah. Insofar as the heavenly city would exist, according to Rodrigo's critique here initially, it could only be manifested in this life, in the words of Augustine, as a delight of good conscience within the individual mind. But this was not the end of his discussion of the heavenly city. Despite these 3 critiques, Rodrigo also paradoxically rejected the counter notion that the heavenly city could only exist in the mind. Because thinking of the earthly paradise metaphorically, Rodrigo claimed, was a failure to think realistically. I'm thinking here of Back to the Future. Marty, you're not thinking 4th dimensionally. Worse, it did not account for the words of Jeremiah 31:40, that the sanctuary of the Lord will not be torn down or destroyed forever. And so from this position, Rodrigo articulated an alternative and more complex view. Citing Isaiah 60, behold, they will come from afar. He suggested that soon, in the time before the general resurrection, a joyful community would form on earth, a city in which he or she who was formerly humble and oppressed would now exult above all in sovereignty and rejoice over all in beatitude, end quote. This would be a sanctified city, he said, one built from living stones, joining together in a process of continual reformatio of both society and the natural world. But how? How was this city supposed to work in practice? Now, look, given the time constraints, I'm going to need to summarize this part about living stones. Drawing on what I'll say is that drawing on Peter Comesta's idea of the Vivi Lapides, the living stones, Rodrigo believed that these stones stood for the polished and refined members of a community that would participate in something that Peter Comesta and Alan of Lille had called the Ecclesia Militans, or the fighting church. So the Ecclesia Militans would appear on earth in the time before the apocalypse. Peter Comesta had specified that this Ecclesia Militans would be a millennial community, a gathering not only of men, but of men and angels, established on earth in a process of, admittedly ambiguous, similitude. And for Rodrigo, the fighting church was the seed of a civic community, something he called the Civitas Bonorum, which would help to build the edifice of the celestial city on earth through virtues and good works. But look, there's not time for that. What I want to talk about now in more detail is a more astonishing aspect, I think, of Rodrigo's philosophy. The idea that for the living stones of this heavenly city to appear on earth, the planet itself would first need to go through its own process of reformatio. Our earth is a paradise. I'll put the slide up. Whoops. Our earth is a paradise, Rodrigo said, that human treachery has driven into a place of extermination. And this place of extermination now needed to be fixed through the course of apocalyptic time. How would this planetary reformatio operate? As Rodrigo explains in his Dialogus, nature itself consists of 2 parts, and he's drawing here on Alan of Lille. 1, natura naturans, and 2, natura naturata. The first of these, natura naturans, corresponds to eternal nature, to God, understood by Rodrigo as the prime maker and initial mover of all things in the planetary environment. And the second, natura naturata corresponds to created nature, the flora, fauna, and all other matter of the universe. As Lucy Pick has pointed out, these concepts were based on the work of Alan of Lille, who adopted similar categories, albeit with slightly different terminology, across his writing. But as Pick also notes, Rodrigo's natura naturata departed from Alan's concept in one critical dimension. It endowed, and this is huge, really, it endowed created nature with an inbuilt agency of its own. Beyond simply referring to entities in creation, Rodrigo's natura naturata meant the power that infused the natural world, a self-perpetuating power or force that pulses, Rodrigo said, through created things, which then acts as the stimulus both for life to be generated and reproduced. So how does natura naturata work through our material environment? I understand this is complex for 10 minutes. To understand this, we need to understand Rodrigo's accompanying concept of the world machine. Originally associated with Neoplatonic cosmology, the term mundi machinum referred in the 1100s to the technical ordering of the heavens and earth, and specifically to those aspects of nature that appear to move like machines through their own momentum, the tides of the seas, the winds, the movements of the stars. And yet, in Rodrigo's writing, the world machine had a more complex, integrated status. Following again Alan of Lille's De Planctu Naturae, Rodrigo understood humanity itself as a constituent feature of the Machina Mundi, and consequently believed that any restoration of this world machine needed to involve a restoration of the human body itself, its equilibrium, and a harmonizing of all the tensions and discordances in the blood, bones, and biology of life. As he explained this in Book 5, Part 12 of his Dialogus, by the power of the deity, our bodies will be reformed in humility and configured to his glorious body. And he will restore the world machine, which has been deformed by the sins of men, to a purer essence, one in which it is predicted there will be exaltation not only in the human, but also in animated creatures. How might this, the reconfiguration of the body, translate into lived reality? This was a controversial point of apocalyptic theology from the mid-12th century onwards. Writers like Otto of Freising had argued that this reconfiguration needed to involve a homogenizing of our physical substances in this life, so that, in Otto's words, those with pimples would lose their blemishes and Ethiopians would lose their blackness. But we have enough in Rodrigo's writing to see that for him, unlike Otto, paradise, both on earth and in heaven, would not be like that. It would be a space of diverse ethnicities. Citing Isaiah again, he argued that the perfected Christian community would consist of people, quote, from every region, from every climate, from every race who believe in the gospel. Naturally, he assumed this diversity would ultimately be abetted by conversion, that the diversity of customs and religions would fold in the process of apocalyptic Christianization. But this conversion would only take place after the arrival of Antichrist. So what about the time before? Now, at no point in the Dialogus does Rodrigo ever make the explicit claim that any contemporary society already embodied his ideal city. But in his De Rebus Hispaniae, written around 30 years after the Dialogus, Rodrigo returned to several of the same idealized capacities while describing his own city of Toledo. First, there was the cathedral, which he paralleled with an outline of the construction of Solomon's temple. And then, describing preparations for the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in July 1212, a battle, of course, that he was at, he wrote in language that matches his own apocalyptic passages in the Dialogus about how Toledo welcomed citizens from a wide diversity of ethnic and cultural backgrounds gathered there to fight. Quote, and the royal city began to be filled with people, to abound in necessaries, to be branded with arms, to be diversified in languages, and to be varied in cults, for a variety of different nations flocked to it from almost all parts of Europe in the zeal of war. How then to take Rodrigo's ideal of interfaith government? There is a paradox at the heart of his theology of diversity. On the one hand, it's true, he saw greater diversity also as a movement that took humanity further away from God. But then he also had a conviction that increasing diversity was a necessary precondition of apocalyptic restoration. How to resolve this tension? The fact is, Rodrigo never saw the existing Christian culture of Europe's intellectual heartland, the Christianity of Paris, for example, as the model culture to which diverse others should conform. No, rather, his ideal of a restored and unified community was one predicated on the kind of coexistence he had already experienced in Toledo. Languages, ethnicities, and ideas would need to continue as a precondition that these diversities could then be consumed, combined, and appropriated by a new apocalyptic dominant culture. Christians such as himself needed to plunder Islamic and Jewish wisdom, Rodrigo felt, and art for all that was beautiful and true, and then assimilate these elements for a newly unified Christian culture to come to be. Only then would the original fragments that had once been part of the unity of humanity be brought back together in a political project which Rodrigo felt had no lesser aim than reconfiguring the substance of the world machine itself. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's very rich, and there's a lot to unpack there. Really appreciate it. I think it leads very nicely into our subsequent two papers. And I think the discussion that we'll have questions at the end. We'll be able to draw some very interesting connections between them. So moving on to our second paper, we have Dr. Alex Mallet, who's a historian of medieval Syria. And he has a particular interest in Christian and Muslim interrelations and the impact of the Crusades on the region. But I also think that it's worth pointing out that Alex is also one of the sort of leading names in the contemporary historiography of the medieval Middle East, and has co-edited a number of volumes about Islamic authors, and is really quite uniquely placed amongst historians who look at this period in being able to engage with both the Latin and the Arabic sources we're presented with, which is a great boon for us who only have one feet in one or other of those camps. Alex is an associate professor at Waseda University in Japan. He's published two monographs: Popular Muslim Reactions to the Franks in the Levant, 1097 to 1291, came out with Ashgate in 2014, and more recently, Christian-Muslim Relations During the Crusades, which was published with Archimanides Press in their Future Imperfect series in 2023. As I say, he's edited or co-edited quite a few of these very important volumes on historiography and bibliography, including most recently Arabic Textual Sources for the Crusades, which came out with Brill in 2024. And today, Alex is going to be talking to us, giving us advice on how to legitimize an illegitimate government, a case study of early Burid Damascus from 1104 to 1128.
Okay, thank you very much, Gregory. I shall share the screen now. Okay, thank you. When Tuktakin assumed control of Damascus in 1104, thereby starting the short-lived Burid dynasty, he did so without hereditary claim or immediate confirmation for him, his overlord, the great Seljuk Sultan, whose court was in Iraq and Persia. Tuktakin had begun his career as a Mamluk, a slave soldier, in the household of the Seljuk ruler Tutush, and upon Tutush's death in battle in 1095, later served as Atabeg, or guardian, essentially, to Tutush's underage son Dukak, who was at that point ruler of Damascus. Within months of Dukak's death in 1103, however, he was ruling Damascus in his own name and would continue to do so until 1128. The problem, therefore, for this leader was not simply how he was to govern successfully, but more importantly, how he could ensure that such a politically irregular accession was regarded as legitimate by the population and by other powers. It was the wider political context that made his rise possible. After the death of the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah in 1092, the Seljuk Empire entered a prolonged period of civil conflict that significantly weakened central authority. Syria, already peripheral to the Seljuk heartlands in Iraq and Persia, as you can see from this map here, fragmented into effectively autonomous city-based regimes. In this environment, authority increasingly depended upon control of soldiers, financial resources, and local networks, moving away from strict dynastic succession. Political order in early 12th century Syria, therefore, started to be negotiated primarily within the various urban centers themselves. The death of Dukak, the previous and underage ruler of the city, created an immediate succession crisis in Damascus. Child Seljuk heirs remained in the city, and their presence meant the possibility of factional disputes among competing military elites who could have supported one or the other for their own advantage. While their being Seljuks made them symbols of dynastic continuity, their youth thus meant they were also potential causes of instability. However, within a very short time, these remaining direct descendants in Damascus had either, very conveniently for Tuktakin, died or been forced out of the city. With the local dynastic line extinguished, possibly though always within the realm of deniability through the machinations of Tuktakin himself, he moved to take over. The transition appears to have avoided widespread urban violence, preserving the civic order despite the intense vulnerability of such a moment, to which his previous position as the de facto leader to the underage Tuktakin certainly helped. Circumstance, preparation, and timing thus combined to make his assumption of power possible. However, even after taking over Damascus, his authority remained insecure for nearly a decade. He lacked formal recognition from the Seljuk Sultan, and rumors from Baghdad that there were plans afoot to remove him generated persistent unease within the Damascene court. Seljuk armies operating in northern Syria served as reminders that intervention from the east remained very possible. Control of the city was therefore not enough. Legitimacy required careful construction across administrative, social, and symbolic domains. One key strategy involved restoring property and administrative stability. Our central contemporary narrative, the City Chronicle by Ibn al-Qalanisi, who seems to have worked in Tuktakin's government, emphasizes the return of confiscated lands, the correction of unjust taxation practices, and the revival of abandoned villages and irrigation systems. These measures correspond closely to established expectations of Islamic ideal rule. Material recovery reassured landowners and urban notables alike that the regime prioritized stability, and its visible competence managing resources reinforced confidence in the new order. Elite network building was equally important. Tuktakin distributed iqtar, or tax farming grants, and high offices to the Turkish and Kurdish military commanders whose support underpinned his rule. These patronage arrangements created reciprocal obligations and mutual interest in regime survival. At the same time, he maintained reliance upon a cadre of local Arab secretaries for administration, finance, and diplomacy, thereby ensuring continuity with established Damascene families, some of whom the newly arrived Turkish rulers, headed by Tuktakin himself, married into to ensure further continuity. The Majlis, a council composed of various local potentates, offered structured consultation and mediated relations between ruler and broader society. Governance of the city thus operated through cooperation with the various factions rather than coercive domination, which may have led to more local resistance. Another crucial element in the consolidation of Tuktakin's authority was his relationship with the religious classes of Damascus. Political legitimacy in early 12th century Syria required alignment with jurists, preachers, and other scholars who shaped public moral discourse. The Majlis itself included jurists alongside military commanders and administrators, indicating that religious voices were structurally embedded within the government. Tuktakin's policies towards mosques, endowments, and religious patronage further reinforced this connection, and construction and restoration projects associated with his rule, particularly around the Great Umayyad Mosque, which you can see here, with the protection and support of Sunni institutions, embedding this regime within the city's religious landscape. In addition to these internal policies, external recognition was pursued and consolidated. In 1116, Tuktakin traveled to Baghdad and secured formal confirmation as ruler of Damascus and de jure, if not de facto, all of Syria. This decree made his authority within the Seljuk political framework official and reduced the deep concern that he would be removed, which had suffused the first half of his period ruling the city. Simultaneously, relations with the Seljuk's main rivals, the Shi'i Fatimids based in Cairo, provided him with both military support and symbolic endorsement and reinforced his standing within Syria's religiously diverse environment, where many of his subjects were Shi'i. Military confrontation with the Franks of the neighboring Crusader states added another dimension to this process. Campaigns against the Franks were framed in Damascene chronicles as jihad, presenting the ruler as defender of Muslim territory from the infidels. In a frontier society as Damascus was, marked by insecurity, defense against external enemies carried considerable moral and religious authority, reinforcing political credibility and connected government with religious obligation and communal protection. By the time of his death in 1128, the irregular circumstances of Tuktakin's accession had been largely forgotten due to the accumulated record of his rule. Through economic restoration, elite integration, external confirmation, and participation in recognized political and religious norms, his authority had become settled and durable. In early 12th century Damascus, legitimacy was thus not automatic through genealogy, but was rather assembled gradually through performance, recognition, network building, and time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, there's the way in which the negotiation with these various communities that are making up the Syria of the Damascus context of Tuktakin, I think is a really interesting theme that I'd like to explore a bit more in the questions. But in the interest of time, we'll move on to Dr. Gianluca Raccagni, who is a historian of crusading, but from the other side of the coin. But he's also has very widespread interests over the course of his research career, which started out looking at the political culture of Italy, the papacy, and the empire in the High Middle Ages. And he's currently working on, as I'll say a bit more about in a moment, links between the Mediterranean and Scandinavia, which in fact Gianluca will say more about very shortly. Gianluca is a senior lecturer in medieval history at the University of Edinburgh. He's also there the coordinator of the History and Games Lab. He has written a monograph published by OUP, which appeared in 2010, on the Lombard League, 1167 to 1225. And the research he's going to share with us today comes from the Leverhulme Research Fellowship, which is also funded by a number of other institutions, all creating a project for which Gianluca is the principal investigator, entitled A Viking in the Sun, Harald Hardrada, the Mediterranean and the Nordic World, between the late Viking Age and the eve of the Crusades. And this also connects with another one of Gianluca's interests, which I think is particularly fascinating, which is the gamification of history and cultural heritage. So a book about wargaming in the context of Harald Hardrada's career has already been published by Gianluca, and he's currently working, contributing to an EU and Italian government-funded regeneration project in Gradara in Italy, for which he's working on a gamification of the city's cultural heritage in the Gradara Model Project. But for today, Gianluca is going to be talking to us about multi-ethnicity in 11th century Mediterranean armies and its challenges. Kikomenos on Harald Hardrada. So thank you very much, Gianluca.
Thank you for the invitation. Yes, my brief talk today is based on my Viking in the Sun project, which explores the career of Harald Hardrada, especially in the first part of his life, even if then we consider also his kingship. Harald is generally known by the Harald Sigurdsson is generally known by the epithets Hardrada and the Last Viking. And the best example of that comes here from Oslo City Hall. There is a big boardroom called the Harald the Hardrada room. On one side, Hardrada refers to his hard rule in Norway, and you can see there is a tapestry depicting his foundation of Oslo, or his role in the rise of Oslo. And on the other side of the boardroom, there is a big tapestry on the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which is what I gave in the epithet the Last Viking, because his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 became a prelude to the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest. So he's a very iconic, his death was a very iconic pivot in the historic shift that marked the end of the Anglo-Viking world and heralded what soon became the Anglo-French Angevin one. But what is missing from those epithets or public installations is Harald's formative Mediterranean adventures, which are the topic of the Viking in the Sun project. So he's certainly the best known Viking visitor to the Mediterranean. And here I can use both the term Viking and Sun because they are, we can find them in the skaldic poetry of his court referring to his Mediterranean adventures. So he's the best known visitor to the Mediterranean, but this project explores his surprisingly unsung status as best evidenced Viking in the Sun, including the fact that he is the only Viking in the Sun for whom we have his own voice through his skaldic poetry. You can see his travels, even if I need to update this map because I think it can be argued that he also visited North Africa, Tunisia, and Libya, and he went as far east as modern-day Jordan. So these are some of the locations that he saw in the Mediterranean. So that would be top left, the Judean desert, Mars-like Judean desert, probably Edessa, Constantinople for sure, the Danube, Jerusalem, the Greek Isles, and Sicily, Mount Etna in that case. So that is the project has a international collaborative dimension. I mean, the Leverhulme is a personal research fellowship. In fact, I'm writing a monograph on him, on the first part of his life and his world. But the project has a strong international collaborative approach. The nodal points of the collaborative strand are symposia held along Harald's Trail and in other significant locations. Will be published by Brepols in this new series, The Mediterranean and Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. The latest workshop was held last November in Siracusa, in Sicily. You can see here bottom left, and that was about multi-ethnicity in 11th century armies. And what I took today is a specific strand of that. Harald was in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium and was a member of a very cosmopolitan Byzantine army, even if the point of the workshop was to discuss the fact that the Byzantine army was certainly not unique in its cosmopolitan and multicultural features in the Mediterranean, especially that was less the case in Scandinavia. But yes, they are the Varangians of the Byzantine army left famous graffiti and signs of their presence there. You can see the Piraeus lion, and on the right there is a Viking ship scratched inside Hagia Sophia. Both, I mean, the Viking ship predates Harald. In fact, Harald was not a pathfinder. He mostly followed well-trodden Norse routes. Now, one aspect of the aspect I will talk about today are the challenges that we encounter in these, especially the multi-ethnic Byzantine army, by looking at the point of view of Harald and that of a testimony, eyewitness, Kekavmenos. Now, Kekavmenos is very important regarding the reconstruction of Harald's travels, because essentially his work has been used as fact-checking. Fact-checking that is required because Nordic sources are mostly come from typologies of sources which tend to attract skepticism regarding their historical reliability. A default skepticism, which I've been arguing, at least in other cases, is not well founded. But the problem comes with typologies of sources such as Skaldic poetry and Icelandic sagas. Here you can see a rune stick with part of with some verses by Harald himself. But these Skaldic verses, essentially the problem with them and Icelandic sagas is that Skaldic verses by Harald would have been composed around the middle of the 11th century, but they were written down only in Icelandic sagas in the beginning of the 13th century. So we don't know to what extent these Skaldic poems were real, changed, or indeed forgeries. Besides, the problem with Icelandic sagas is that they also include a lot of tales which are obviously fictional. Morkinskinna, which is the oldest of these king's sagas from the beginning of the 13th century, has a lot of these fictional tales, including Harald engaging in demon hunting and dragon slaying in Byzantium. He would have the emperor apparently threw him in a pit to be he fed him to his pet dragon, the pet dragon of the Byzantine emperor, and Harald killed it with a barber razor. I've been arguing that to some extent this story might have been influenced either by things like the snake column in Constantinople, or even more importantly by Sigurd the Dragon Slayer stories from Scandinavia, because of Skaldic evidence. I will not expand on that here. But essentially, better if I use these source. Essentially, Kekavmenos has been used for fact-checking. And of course, you cannot find the dragon slaying or demon hunting in Kekavmenos. Kekavmenos, I like to describe his text as something as an equivalent of if we had a Native American version of the events depicted in the Vinland sagas. Here we got a totally independent Byzantine source depicting or at least providing a summary of Harald's career, written by someone who probably met him, because Kekavmenos said that he was serving the Byzantine army at the same time as Harald and in some of the same campaigns, especially the Bulgarian campaign. Who is Kekavmenos? Kekavmenos is a Byzantine general coming from the provincial aristocracy. And he wrote a work that is generally known today as Strategicon. Now, my critique of the way that this work has been used as fact-checking for Harald is that on one side it's incredibly useful because it's totally independent from Nordic sources and confirms some of them while not mentioning others. So from a purely fact-checking point of view, I don't think that precludes some events. I'm not talking about the demon hunting or the dragon slaying, but in Nordic sources, Harald led missions to North Africa, for example, to Jerusalem, and those are not mentioned here. One can argue, however, that Kekavmenos was remembering by what on top of his head were what he knew about Harald, and he met him at the end of Harald's career. So all these events that are not mentioned by Kekavmenos probably took place at the beginning of Harald's career in Byzantium. But really, what I wanted to discuss today is the challenges and the frictions between this cosmopolitan army and the native Byzantine members of the army, like Kekavmenos. So we got two very different points of view. And such frictions. So the Varangians are often described as the most loyal of the foreigners, and even among the Byzantine military units. But there were certainly frictions. So if you look at Skaldic poetry, it celebrates how Harald would have taken part, or indeed a leading part, according to the Skaldic poets, in the blinding of Emperor Michael V. So that is why it's the event that is the most celebrated in the Skaldic poetry about Harald. The sources do not confirm Harald participation, but it is plausible because they don't exclude it either. But what I wanted to focus here was on the fact that Kekavmenos did not write a history book. The Strategicon is not a history book, so that should be considered when we use it as for fact-checking. Kekavmenos was writing a book of advice, and I mentioned Harald in a section on advice on the emperor. So what he's doing is writing advice and then using Harald Hardrada as a case study, as an example to support his argument. So he's not trying to write a comprehensive account of Harald's career. He had no access probably on documentation. He simply thought about it based on what he remembered. And essentially, he's using Harald to make a very specific point. And he includes only evidence that is supporting that point, which is the one highlighted here. Do not promote foreigners who are not of royal birth in their own land to great honors, nor entrust great offices to them, for you will certainly injure yourself by doing so. So you can see here probably the frictions between the native military aristocracy and foreigner military leaders who are coming to serve in the Byzantine army. And the point that essentially Kekavmenos is making is that they shouldn't be rewarded. Well, they should be rewarded according to their social standing in their own countries. So it's not really in favor of using the Byzantine army as for social mobility. And he clearly says you should reward them as less as possible. He says, if they serve for clothing and bread, be assured they will serve your faithful and wholeheartedly. And then he mentions how previous emperors, successful emperors, had always done that. They had rewarded these foreign military leaders as less as possible. Then he uses three case studies: a Frank, an Armenian, and a Varangian, to support the same point. And again, when we look at what is missing from Harald's career, we should consider that his case study is already longer than the other two combined. So it was not clearly Kekavmenos was trying to be as brevity was very important for Kekavmenos in that. And basically what he says is that Harald fought consistently well for the Byzantine emperor in campaigns in Sicily and Bulgaria. He was rewarded with low and medium level titles, and he was very happy with that. He went home, and it ends by saying that, yes, he went home as Kekavmenos expect him to do, and he didn't grumble because he had been given the title of lictor or spator or candidato, but instead, even when he was ruling in Norway, he kept faith and friendship towards the Romans. Now, it is interesting to see the other point of view, the one of Harald, because in Icelandic sources, Harald carved out the eyes of Michael V because he was mistreated by him. So we have a very different point of view. And according to Morkinskinna, he was fed to the pet dragon of the Byzantine emperor because Harald had kept more booty than what was allowed by the Byzantine emperor. So I wanted to show this friction between foreign military leaders and the Byzantine military aristocracy through the case study of Harald Hardrada, which is a little bit the way we are using him as a case study for the study of the Mediterranean in the 11th century and relationship with Northern Europe in that period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianluca. That's the three really fantastic papers. I've got lots of questions, but I'm aware that we already have questions turning up in the chat, so I'm going to hold my fire and let questions come in from the floor first, and then if there's time, I can circle around. But to begin with, we have a question from Terry Marsh, who has a question for Peter. says, thank you for your fascinating presentation. Could you please speak to Rodrigo's relationships with King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Pope Innocent III and the planning of the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa? And if I could perhaps piggyback onto that question, it's very interesting, Rodrigo's meditations on the Holy City, seen in an eschatological sense, but given the connection with Las Navas de Tolosa, which fits into a wider, more loosely understood crusading movement, do we know anything about his attitudes towards the terrestrial city of Jerusalem and its importance in crusading? Does he ever talk about that? But answer Terry's question first, and then if you have thoughts on the terrestrial Jerusalem in Rodrigo's thought, I'd be interested to hear those as well.
I'm going to disappoint Terry because I'm just, my knowledge of the military side of it is so, I've focused so much on Rodrigo's intellectual life, his theology. My actual engagement with his role in the battle is pretty poor. I suspect that others would know more about that, other than I think, obviously Rodrigo's rich intellectual life in Paris beforehand. Look, I think in terms of Jerusalem, it's astonishing how little he talks about crusading to Jerusalem, or crusading as a project that goes out beyond Iberia. But no, the crusading side, I'm very poor on the crusading side of it, Gregory. So I'm going to just disappoint everyone and not talk about crusading. I'm really sorry.
No, not at all. I mean, it's. I suppose that answer in itself is a rather interesting one. That crusading, he has these reflections on the celestial Jerusalem, and yet the terrestrial Jerusalem, despite the fact that he's interested in the Ecclesia Militans actually sorry?
The architecture is important to Rodrigo.
The architecture is important, okay. But it's
an extended section where he talks about the temple. But yeah, sorry.
Right, okay. But he's clearly interested in the Ecclesia Militans as a kind of physically armed adventure at Las Navas. But the expedition to the terrestrial Jerusalem doesn't. The fact that doesn't appear in his intellectual writings, I think, sounds like it's significant in its own right. If people have questions, do either raise your hand. Are people able to raise their hands in the and ask questions live, or do they have to do it through the Q&A? Do it through the Q&A. So there's a Q&A panel down at the bottom. There's a button there, and please do put in any questions you might have there. I have a question for, well, I suppose it speaks to all three papers, but in a way, I think Peter's perhaps already answered it, which is we organized this session, and I wanted to give the speakers as much free rein as possible to address the aspects that interested them. So the title was about challenges to government, which is fairly broad, but I think it's significant that all three of our papers address to some degree these questions of diversity, rather unbidden. And I suppose that speaks to what we do when we study the Mediterranean at all. It's an area where there is so much commerce between different cultures. It's bound to be very diverse. But to Gianluca and Alex, I wondered if you had any thoughts about the way in which diversity is understood by your authors, or by the cultures that produce your sources, as to whether this is simply a means of creating a virtue out of necessity. Is this simply something that people can fall back on in a crisis? And then when the crisis passes, we'd rather kind of get rid of these inconvenient Shia or Norsemen or Arabs, and then replace them with Turks or with good, Greek-speaking Byzantines? Or is it that diversity is, perhaps as Peter is suggesting in Rodrigo's idea of the celestial Jerusalem, not a bug, but a feature of society that is to be encouraged for, not necessarily for its own sake, but to be encouraged as a normal part of society? Do you have any thoughts on that?
From my point of view, it's certainly a feature of the Syrian landscape at this time that there were so many different diverse groups, and not just the religious groups, as you've mentioned, but the different ethnic groups as well. And obviously there's the difference between the nomads and the kind of more city-dwelling population as well. So this really was a very strong feature of the society at the time. And I think I did kind of touch on it in the talk that Tughtekin himself and his government used that as a strength. So he had this quite significant Shia population within his territory, which could have, in a sense, had their allegiance to the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo, but he deliberately went and sought recognition of his rule from that very same government, and then did military campaigning with them in order to get the recognition from that Shia population. And again, with the various different types of ethnic groups, each of those ethnic groups had a very kind of defined rule within the governmental structure. So you had the Arabs, for example, being the secretaries and basically running the government because they knew Arabic, whereas the Persians and the Turks and the Kurds didn't, or didn't know it to as high a standard as was necessary to work in that kind of institution. The Turks and the Kurds were very much the military campaigners because they were very good at fighting, and so they were assigned that kind of role. So this kind of diversity was very much a feature, and the government then took that feature and used it to strengthen its own position.
Thank you very much. Gianluca, do you have any thoughts on that? You're still muted, Gianluca.
I'm muted because my kid made an incursion in the room. No, I think that in the case of the Byzantine Empire, its multicultural and multi-ethnic features are part of its prestige. I mean, in the Nordic world, as far as Iceland, the Byzantine emperor was considered the most prestigious ruler to serve. And that is what attracted Harald. So in a sense, Harald went there because he thought that serving in the Byzantine army would have, for him, being a vehicle of social mobility. At the time, he was a refugee from Norway, essentially, and that he made money and prestige in Byzantium sufficient for him then to conquer to seize the crown of Norway. So this multi-ethnic inclusivity of the Byzantine Empire is part of its prestige over other kingdoms and other polities. But of course, that creates obviously tensions with the local Byzantine aristocracy, and that is the point of view of Kekamenos. And because Kekamenos says, if you give all these titles and money to these foreign rulers who come here, and they come here regardless, he said, because of the greatness of Byzantium, what will you offer to local Byzantine members of the local aristocracy? So I think that is a key feature of Byzantium at the time.
Do you want me to add anything, Gregory? Or have I already covered this one with the paper? Or
if you have something to add, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, please.
Okay, well, no, it's interesting. I mean, about prestige, there was a very interesting point. But I think the problem with Rodrigo really is he's writing theologically, and so he's writing about an idealized community, and it can be a little abstract. So the ideal is to have a community of people of all races and communities who come together, but ultimately to be converted, in the time of the apocalypse. So in some sense, diversity is to be tolerated and enjoyed insofar as it's a precondition for not diversity, which is what will follow. So there is a tension there. On the other hand, the political project and the theological project are never the same thing, right? So that, in a sense, Rodrigo, you imagine can sort of conveniently use one as an excuse for the other. I think the interesting tension in a lot of these theologians is how much this is going to actually map out into a physical environment. And so when Rodrigo talks about a continuous process of reformation whereby people's bodies will become more and more alike to the idealized body, other theologians had said that this would be physical and obvious physical transformation. Rodrigo, I think, is hinting at a more of a substantive rather than accidental change, in the sense that this, like the Eucharist, that people's bodies will be reconfigured in a substantial way, but perhaps the accidents of how they appear will remain the same. So it's an intriguing tension. Ultimately, Rodrigo seems to, I think, be very favorable towards the diversity of people and sees that as a precondition for an apocalyptic, idealized community. How he feels, I think the ambivalence is absolutely fascinating and rich for how he feels about witnessing that homogenization process take place in an apocalyptic time.
Yeah, I mean, if I can follow up on that, I suppose one of the things that struck me in your paper when you were talking about his descriptions of diversity in response to the preparations for Las Navas is that when we think about diversity in Spain, we often tend to think of it in terms of convivencia and Christians, Muslims, Jews all interacting with each other. And of course, Rodrigo has his own history with the way his attitudes towards Islam, his attitudes towards Judaism, which are, as you pointed out, very, very instructive. But in those passages where he's talking about the multiplicity of languages as everyone's being brought in to prepare for Las Navas, it struck me that presumably a lot of the multiplicity of languages is a multiplicity that is a multiplicity of Romance languages, right? Because it's amongst the French and the Occitan and Catalan speaking knights who are coming to prepare for the muster against the Muslims. So, do you have any thoughts on the extent to which that diversity is appropriate to a Latin Christendom that is very culturally diverse? Whereas as you say, that the elements of Moorish or Jewish culture that might be brought in and have to be purified sit at sort of a second remove, where there's a sort of a better diversity and a second tier diversity that he's interested in. Or is that reading too much into your?
No, I think the first point is really important, that actually the crusading host becomes a really important symbol of what a diverse, idealized Christian community can look like. Otto Freising talks about, his observations of crusade and how that sort of coming together of people with different languages communicating as one was a very powerful image for him. And he uses that when he's describing his kind of the process through which Earth is transforming itself towards something like a millennial kingdom. Not quite. And some of Havelberg is the same. This becomes a model for so the crusading hosts do become models precisely because it's an experience of a multilinguistic, multicultural community, essentially, that comes together, albeit temporarily, but for over a long period of time, as one. So that's a powerful model. Rodrigo is aware of and using that, I think, in that passage when he's describing Las Navas. On the other hand, I think it's a more subtle divide. I don't think the divide is so clear cut when you have Mozarabs, and you have so many communities who are speaking languages which coincide with the communities which are, in other ways othered in that way that you mentioned. So I think for Rodrigo, it's not such a clear-cut distinction. I think the coming together of a multiplicity of languages and communities and cultures and ways of practicing community together is something that he's idealizing as symbolic of an apocalyptic moment, or as embodying an apocalyptic moment. And I don't think he's necessarily making that distinction so much between a crusading host and perhaps an existing community of people who are being converted.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. There's a question from Michael Fulton in the chat. This is for Alex. Looking at the situation in Aleppo, how does the situation or process of legitimization there compare following the death of Ridwan of Aleppo?
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Yes, just for some context for those who don't know, Ridwan was the other surviving son of Tutush, and therefore he was Dukak's brother. Dukak, the leader in Damascus before Tuktakin. After he died in 1113, his successors were all very, very weak, and it's generally seen as being the cause of the decline of Aleppo, its weakness, and all these different states around it trying to kind of pick off the carcass as it was at the time. But actually, I think that the question would be more interesting to go back to Ridwan himself, because it's really with his rule, I think, that you see a real contrast between how Damascus is governed and how Aleppo is governed. Now, Tuktakin, as I said in the in the talk, tried very hard to get everybody on board with what he was doing. He was a fairly old, fairly experienced military commander, and so he seemed to know how the system was working. But Ridwan, who was only about 12 or 13 when he came to the throne of Aleppo, fairly quickly afterwards sought to lessen the power, lessen the influence of a lot of those people in Aleppo who had been there before. And a lot of the emirs and the rulers under his father Tutush actually left and went to join rival dynasties in the various towns and cities around Aleppo. Instead, what Ridwan seems to have done is get very close to the Ahdath, these kind of local military groups full of local Arabs. And he didn't communicate very well with all the other cities around him either. So he seems to have, probably not deliberately, obviously, but he seems to have alienated a lot of the very commanders and the very experienced people, being only a teenager, that he should have relied upon. So the real beginning of Aleppo's decline actually comes with his reign. And then afterwards, in that period after 1113, is really just the fruits of what Ridwan was doing at the time.
Thank you very much. Should we call it there? I mean, if there are any final questions, put them in the chat very quickly. Otherwise, it's 6 o'clock. I think we'll call it there. But I just want to give a big thank you again to our three speakers for three really stimulating papers that spoke to each other in some unexpected and really fruitful ways. And as we can't hear an actual round of applause, just applaud you all on everyone else's behalf. But thank you all very much for your papers, and thank you all very much for attending and for your questions. And I'll hand over now to Antonella, who will see us out.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this fascinating session indeed, to all our speakers and to our chair for brilliantly coordinating all the questions. So I just want to say thank you also to everyone who has attended this session. As always, your support is very much appreciated, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session, which is on the 18th of March. With Amira Banniston, and you will receive, as always, an invitation and further information on the session soon. So lovely to see you all. Take care and see you soon. Bye.